December 17, 1944, 5:30 in the morning, in Honsfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank's engine coughed, sputtered, and then stopped. SS officer Joachim Peiper hit the metal hatch hard, the loud clang echoing in the cold dark before sunrise. His driver, Unterscharführer Weber, tried again and again to start the 700 horsepower Maybach engine, but it didn't move at all. The fuel gauge showed empty. Weber's voice came from below, shaking with fear as he said the reserve tank was dry too. Peiper climbed out of his command tank, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. All around him stood the most powerful armored force the Germans had gathered for Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive, now completely still. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and almost 5,000 of Germany's best Waffen SS soldiers, all stuck with no fuel to move. Through the morning fighting, Peiper saw the old American position head, the town of Honsfeld, which had been an important supply post for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had left so fast they didn't even put out the fires still burning in oil drums, and there was still warm coffee sitting in metal cups. And then, standing neatly in rows like a gift from the god of war himself, were thousands of jerry cans, the familiar olive-green American fuel containers. Peiper walked toward them slowly, almost like in awe. His assistant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruber, opened one can and smelled the gasoline, real high-octane American fuel. The soldiers quickly began refueling their tanks and trucks, working fast and excited. Peiper moved through the stockpile counting, doing the math in his head. It was incredible. 50,000 gallons, enough to power his whole group all the way to the Meuse River, maybe even enough to change how the entire battle would go. The Americans had left behind more fuel in this one depot than most German divisions had received in the last 6 months. But as Peiper stood among all that fuel, watching his men fill German tanks with American gasoline, a heavy thought settled over him like the cold morning fog. If the Americans could walk away from this much fuel, if they could leave what Germany would protect with whole armies, then the war was already lost. Germany hadn't just made a mistake, it had completely failed to understand the kind of enemy it was fighting. 6 months before Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, gave the Führer a report that should have stopped every German attack right then. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, the lifeblood of its army, had been almost wiped out by Allied bombers. The Leona works, which had made 175,000 tons of fuel in April, made only 5,000 by September. The big hydrogenation plants at Pölitz, Blechheimer, and Brooks were working at less than 10% capacity. The numbers made the truth clear. Defeat was certain. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, even counting its synthetic fuel and the oil from captured Romanian fields, made only 33 million barrels, less than 2% of what America made. The Third Reich was trying to fight a modern war using horse-drawn wagons for supplies. While America had so much fuel it was almost swimming in it, Major Friedrich Zimmermann from the German Logistics Command had figured out that the Ardennes offensive would need 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Hitler gave them 5 million, but only about half ever arrived because of transport problems. The German leaders were gambling their whole attack on stealing enemy fuel, a plan that showed weakness instead of power. Meanwhile, the Americans had built a huge fuel pipeline system stretching across France called Pluto, meaning pipeline under the ocean, and the Red Ball. The Red Ball Express was a huge convoy system of trucks that carried 12,500 tons of supplies to the front every single day. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were using about 1.2 million gallons of fuel daily and getting 1.4 million gallons delivered, which meant they were building up reserves even while fighting. Joachim Peiper wasn't a fool. At 29, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS. He had the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords and was a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he had learned that in modern war, fuel was even more valuable than bullets. His Kampfgruppe was chosen as the Schwerpunkt, the main strike force of the entire Ardennes offensive. On December 14, 2 days before the attack began, Peiper attended the last briefing in Tondorf, General Sepp Dietrich, who commanded the 6th SS Panzer Army, was direct and clear. You'll have enough fuel to reach the Meuse only if you capture American supplies. The fuel given to Peiper's group was 31,000 gallons, just enough for about 50 miles of fighting, but the Meuse River was 65 miles away. The math of failure was built into the plan from the start. As his column got ready to move on December 16th, Peiper gave strict orders. Tanks would drive in a single line to save fuel. Engines would be turned off during any stop longer than 5 minutes. And capturing American fuel depots was their top goal, even more important than military targets. The difference between the two armies could not have been greater. That very morning, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, just 20 miles from Peiper's starting line, wrote in his unit diary, "Received fuel resupply, 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage tanks already full. December 16th, 1944. At 5:30 in the morning, the German artillery fire that started in Operation Watch on the Rhine used more shells in just 2 hours than the German army had once used for whole battles earlier in the war. But even with that huge show of power, they were still short on supplies." Peiper's column began to move at 7 o'clock, already running late. The roads that looked like wide highways on German maps turned out to be small country paths, many still dirt and mud. Within hours, traffic jams formed as big tanks and trucks made for the open Russian plains got stuck and slowed down in the thick Ardennes forest. At the small village of Landsrath, Peiper's first goal, they ran into a surprise defense from just one American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, only 18 men, who managed to stop the strongest German armored force for almost 10 hours. During that long wait, Peiper's tanks sat with engines running, wasting precious fuel. When they finally broke through and reached Honsfeld at sunrise on December 17th, Peiper's troops had moved only 20 miles but had already used up 40% of their fuel. At that rate, they would run out long before they even got halfway to the Meuse River. The American supply depot at Honsfeld wasn't even a main storage site. It was just a forward fuel point for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division, something the U.S. Army called a Class 3B depot, basically a small temporary fueling area. But what Peiper discovered there was more than the monthly fuel supply for a full German Panzer division. Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruber later said, "We saw piles of jerry cans filled with gasoline. They were stacked like pyramids, about 3 meters high, and stretched for maybe 200 meters. The Americans hadn't even tried to destroy them." The captured fuel was high-grade aviation gasoline mixed with motor fuel, 80 octane or higher. German engines, especially the delicate Maybach ones in Tiger tanks, were built for 74 octane fuel, so the American gasoline was actually too strong, which caused engine troubles in several German vehicles as Peiper's men. As Peiper's men refueled, they kept finding more surprises. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann discovered shipping papers inside the depot office. He could read English because before the war he had worked in his father's import business. The papers showed that this fuel had traveled all the way from Texas to New York, then across the Atlantic Ocean to Liverpool, then across the English Channel to Normandy, and finally trucked about 400 miles to Honsfeld. The whole 6,000-mile trip had taken less than 6 weeks. "I showed the papers to Obersturmführer Peiper," Hoffmann said years later in a 1976 interview. "He read them twice, then crushed them in his hand. He didn't say anything, but his face turned white. We both knew what it meant." Private Ernst Kara found a pile of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, just 2 days earlier. The headline announced the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun that could carry 300,000 gallons a day, a single pipeline that could move more fuel daily than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe would use in the whole attack. To understand Peiper's shock, you have to know how desperate Germany's fuel situation was by late 1944. Since May, Allied bombers had destroyed 90% of the country's synthetic fuel output. The Luftwaffe was grounding planes because there wasn't enough aviation fuel. Pilot training hours had been cut from 250 to just 60. The German Navy's surface ships could barely leave port, and U-boats were using snorkels to save diesel by running longer on batteries. Back home, civilians hadn't seen private cars on the road since 1942. Gasoline was so rare that the Gestapo investigated even small black market thefts of a few liters. Farmers had gone back to using horses to plow their fields. Meanwhile, the United States was pumping out 67% of all the world's oil. The East Texas oil field alone made more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. American refineries were running so fast and strong that Standard Oil was testing new petroleum products simply because they had too much crude to use. With the 50,000 gallons captured at Honsfeld, Peiper's column moved forward fast. By noon on December 17th, they reached Bulge, where they took more supplies, food, ammunition, and most importantly, maps that showed the locations of other American fuel depots nearby. But those maps revealed something shocking. The Americans had fuel everywhere. Every big crossroads had a supply dump. The U.S. First Army alone had 3.5 million gallons saved up. Peiper pushed on to Ligneville, where his troops would commit the Malmedy massacre, killing 84 captured American soldiers. Even that war crime was linked to fuel shortage. Peiper later said he didn't have enough gasoline to move the prisoners. By that evening, December 17th, Peiper's leading tanks reached Stavelot, the site of a huge American fuel depot holding over 2 million gallons. That was enough fuel to reach the Meuse River for sure. But as the German tanks came close, American engineers were already working to stop them. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had gotten word of the German advance. His orders were clear: deny the enemy any fuel, no matter what. The Stavelot depot held 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline stored in jerry cans covering 15 acres of land. At 4:30 in the afternoon, as Peiper's first tanks neared the area, Captain Brewster gave the order. His engineers poured lines of gasoline between the stacks and handed out white phosphorus grenades. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis threw the first one. The explosion was instant and massive, he later said. A wall of fire shot maybe 100 feet into the air. In minutes, the whole depot turned into a blazing sea of flames. When Peiper's lead tanks arrived, they saw a giant black column of smoke rising 1,000 feet high. The fire burned for 3 full days, destroying enough gasoline to drive Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back. Unterscharführer Weber later described it. The Obersturmbannführer stood on his tank and watched the flames. He didn't speak for 5 minutes. Then he climbed down and said, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons just to keep us from getting it. What are we even doing here?" Across the Ardennes, American engineers were burning their own fuel depots rather than let the Germans take them. At Trois Ponts, 1.1 million gallons went up in flames. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed. Altogether, the Americans had purposely burned more than 8 million gallons of fuel in the first week, more than the Germans had planned for the whole offensive. The fact that they could destroy that much fuel without a second thought came from a supply system so advanced the Germans couldn't even imagine it. The Red Ball Express alone had carried 412,000 tons of supplies using 6,000 trucks that ran day and night without stopping. Each truck used about 40 gallons of fuel a day, which meant the delivery system itself burned more fuel than the entire German Army Group B received in a month. By December 1944, the U.S. Motor Transport Service had 230 truck companies driving on color-marked routes that kept traffic moving smoothly. This system brought in 20,000 tons of supplies daily, including 3,000 tons of fuel. Colonel James Snyder, the First Army's chief logistics officer, wrote in his December 18th report, "Fuel received yesterday 1,800,000 gallons. 147,000 gallons. Fuel issued 1,623,000 gallons. Net gain to reserves 224,000 gallons." The American fuel pipeline network was even more amazing. Operation Pluto had stretched pipes under the English Channel, pushing 1 million gallons of gasoline every day from Britain into Europe. More lines were laid across France. The Cherbourg to Paris line moved 800,000 gallons daily, and the Seine line carried 650,000. By December 1944, the Allied armies in Northwest Europe were using about 7.5 million gallons of fuel every day, but receiving over 8.2 million, which meant they were actually building reserves even while fighting. As Peiper's force moved farther into Belgium on December 18th, it became painfully clear that Germany's situation was hopeless. At Stoumont, they captured another small fuel depot, but burned through 5,000 gallons in only 3 hours of battle. The Tiger tanks drank about 2.5 gallons per mile during combat, and the Panther tanks about 1.5 gallons per mile. In the rough, hilly Ardennes terrain, those numbers went up by 40%. Hauptsturmführer Otto Dingler, the maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, wrote, "By noon on December 18th, we had already used 67,000 gallons since the attack began. We had captured maybe 55,000 gallons. We were running short." The Americans, who were listening to German radio messages through ultra intercepts, already knew Peiper's fuel trouble in detail. General Courtney Hodges gave a clear order to every unit. The enemy is almost out of fuel, so destroy any gasoline that might be captured. That same day, American C-47 planes flew 316 missions to Bastogne, dropping supplies that included 160,000 gallons of fuel. The Americans were flying more fuel into one trapped town than Peiper's entire combat group had left. By December 19th, as Peiper's men fought at Stoumont, their fuel crisis had reached its breaking point. Tanks were being left behind not because they were destroyed, but because their fuel tanks were dry. Peiper gathered what little fuel remained, about 8,000 gallons, enough for either one more battle or a retreat, but not both. Meanwhile, Allied planners were calmly preparing for the next month's operations. Brigadier General Morris Gilland requested 245 million gallons of fuel for January, and the request was approved immediately without argument. The difference between the two sides wasn't just how much fuel they had, it was how well they used it. American vehicles were designed for efficiency and easy maintenance. A Sherman tank used only 0.8 gallons per mile, compared to the Tiger tank's 2.5 gallons. Fully loaded American trucks got about 8 miles per gallon, and all shared standardized parts that made repairs simple. The Germans, on the other hand, used a confusing mix of their own and captured vehicles, each needing different fuels, oils, and spare parts. French tanks needed different oil than German Panthers, and Soviet trucks used parts that didn't fit German models. Every difference made their supplies problems worse. On December 20th, Peiper received a radio message. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources. He called his officers together, and Sturmbannführer Werner Poetschke said bluntly, "We have enough fuel for maybe 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30 kilometers away." According to Hauptsturmführer Gruber's later statement, Peiper said quietly, "Gentlemen, we've learned we're fighting an enemy who burns more fuel just to keep it from us than we were given for this entire operation. What we captured at Honsfeld, which seemed like a miracle, was nothing to them. We can't win." That grim truth was spreading fast. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, later wrote at them, "When I learned the Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than let us have it, I knew the offensive was doomed from the start." Colonel Friedrich von Dondorf, captured on December 23rd, told his interrogators, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't even seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons while we measure by the liter. How can we fight against such endless supplies?" By December 21st, Peiper was surrounded at L'Église, his tanks sitting useless with no fuel. The American forces around him, the 30th Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne, and the 3rd Armored Division, had a combined fuel allowance of 340,000 gallons for that single day. Peiper had maybe 1,000 gallons left. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote home saying, "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes that we use more fuel making coffee than they have for their tanks." The American response showed industrial warfare at its highest level. When Patton's Third Army turned north to join the fight, the move alone took 350,000 gallons of fuel, something the Germans would have thought impossible. Yet the Americans did it in just 3 days. On December 23rd, the weather cleared, and Allied planes took to the sky. Over 2,000 aircraft flew that day, each burning fuel at rates that would have grounded the entire Luftwaffe 4 weeks. P-47 fighters used 300 gallons per hour, and B-26 bombers burned 200 gallons per hour. In one single day, the air operations alone used more fuel than Germany's entire allowance for its offensive. That night, between December 23rd and 24th, Peiper abandoned his vehicles and escaped on foot. Out of 119 tanks and assault guns that started the attack, only 39 were still working. But none could move. The crews destroyed them with their last remaining ammunition. Oberstleutnant Heinz Gall described the scene, saying they drained the final drops of fuel from every vehicle, maybe 200 gallons total. The Obersturmbannführer himself destroyed his command tank. Millions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment lost simply because there was no fuel left. Out of 5,000 men in Kampfgruppe Peiper, only about 770 made it back. They had advanced nearly 60 miles, captured several fuel depots, and uncovered the truth about Allied logistics. Word of Peiper's findings spread quickly through the German command. On December 26, Field Marshal Walter Model received detailed reports about the captured American supplies. His chief of staff noted the Field Marshal read the numbers twice: 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed before capture, and finally said, We are not fighting the same war. When Hitler was told on December 28th, he refused to believe it. Historian Speer later wrote, Hitler insisted those figures were lies. When shown photos of Stavelot burning, he said they were faked, made by Hollywood. But the soldiers on the ground knew the truth. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman wrote to his wife, The Americans destroy more fuel in one day than we get in a whole month. They drive tanks the way we march. This war is lost. The fuel crisis showed a deeper truth. By 1944, America produced half of all manufactured goods in the entire world. A new aircraft rolled off assembly lines every five minutes, a new ship every day, a new tank every 7 minutes. The numbers for oil production were just as stunning. The United States produced 1.8 billion barrels. The Soviet Union made 110 million. Germany, including synthetic fuel, managed only 33 million, and Japan barely 2.6 million. Altogether, the Axis powers produced less than 2% of what America alone supplied. After 1942, every German offensive was limited by lack of fuel, while every American attack was backed by an endless flow of supplies that German planners could hardly imagine. On December 27th, Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen wrote about a report he received. A logistics officer warned that bad weather had cut daily fuel deliveries to just 500,000 gallons. And there was brief concern until someone pointed out that even this shortfall was more than Germany had for its entire offensive. German prisoners from the Ardennes were more shocked by American waste than by their firepower. Watching U.S. soldiers throw away half-eaten meals or use gasoline to keep warm hurt their morale more than any artillery barrage. One prisoner, Gustav Reichelt, told interrogators, "We knew your production numbers before, but seeing your soldiers waste more than we ever had made it real. Every German who saw your endless supplies knew the war was lost." Letters home confirmed this truth despite censorship. Corporal Ernst Muller, Arfagita, wrote, "The Americans wash their clothes in gasoline. They feed chocolate to dogs. They fire artillery just to celebrate Christmas. We can't fight infinity." The effect broke the Nazi idea of racial superiority. How could decadent Americans live in such comfort while the so-called master race lacked even basic needs? During the Nuremberg trials, many German leaders later blamed the logistics, especially fuel shortages, as the key factor in their defeat. Field Marshal Kesselring testified, "We had operational superiority in 1940 and 1941. By 1944, we couldn't move our troops for lack of fuel while Americans shifted whole armies like chess pieces." Peiper, who ordered the Malmedy massacre, said in his testimony that every choice after December 17th was shaped by the fuel crisis. They couldn't advance, retreat, or even chase the enemy properly, while the Americans moved without limits. General Heinz Guderian summed it up. "When Peiper captured 50,000 gallons, that meant everything to us but nothing to the Americans. The war was already lost." This story still matters because it shows the moment when industrial warfare reached its full meaning. Wars were now decided by production numbers, not bravery. The romantic idea of noble fighting died in the Ardennes among empty fuel tanks. Historian Dr. Richard Overy later calculated that by 1944, Allied to Axis production ratios were more than 5-to-1 in most major areas. And in oil, the difference was nearly 50-to-1. No amount of training or tactics could overcome that. America built 324,750 aircraft during the war, while Germany produced only 119,907. The Americans made 88,410 tanks compared to Germany's 46,857. But the most striking number was oil. America refined 1.8 billion barrels in 1944 alone, while Germany managed just 33 million. On December 24, 1944, as Peiper's men slipped through American lines on foot, leaving behind 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the true scale of their defeat became clear. They had captured 50,000 gallons of fuel, which once seemed like a miracle, only to learn it meant nothing to an enemy who could afford to burn millions. Führer later said in 1975, "That morning at Honsfeld, when we found American fuel, we felt like we had won the lottery. But that evening, after hearing about Stavelo burning, we knew we had already lost. The Americans had so much they could destroy what we would die to keep." The 50,000 gallons they captured was less than what one American armored division used in 2 days, and even less than what the Red Ball Express burned in just 3 hours, a tiny fraction in Allied daily fuel use. Major General J. Lawton Collins later wrote, "The Germans' desperate attempts to seize fuel showed their fatal mistake. They thought we valued fuel as they did, as something precious. They couldn't understand that we had so much we could burn millions just to avoid losing ground." Operation Watch on the Rhine failed because of simple math. The Germans used about 2.8 million gallons, 40% of what they had, counting what they captured. In the same time, the Americans used 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. But the worst loss was their belief. Every German who saw America's endless supplies realized they weren't fighting a war anymore. They were taking part in their own destruction. Joachim Peiper survived the war and spent years in prison until 1956 for war crimes. On July 14, 1976, he was killed in his home in France by unknown attackers. But in 1967, he told historian Henry Lehman, "Finding that fuel depot was the worst thing. If we had run out earlier, we might have retreated with honor." Instead, we learned the truth. Americans had oceans of everything, and we had only drops. We discovered the meaning of impossibility. The lesson reaches far beyond World War II. In modern war, logistics matter more than tactics. Production power beats bravery. Having plenty defeats pure determination. The German soldier in 1944 was likely better trained and more experienced, but it didn't make a difference. The Americans had an industrial machine so powerful it could waste more than Germany could ever make. This truth was written in every jerrycan at Honsfeld, every gallon burned at Stavelo, every pipeline stretching across France. Wars between industrial nations would always be won by factories and refineries, not by clever generals. Colonel Trevor Dupuy calculated that in December 1944, each American soldier was supplied with 67 pounds of materials daily, while each German got only 3. Americans often complained about waste, but to Germans, that waste looked like unbelievable wealth. In 1984, 40 years after the battle, veterans met again at La Glaise. The museum displayed Peiper's Tiger tank, still sitting where it had stopped when it ran out of fuel on December 23, 1944. Former Unterscharführer Karl Wortmann stood beside it with former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the 30th Infantry Division. "We always wondered why you stopped," Anderson said. "We thought it was a tactical move." Wortmann laughed bitterly. "We stopped because our tanks were empty. You burned millions just to keep it from us. How could we fight that?" Anderson stayed silent for a moment, then said quietly, "We never knew you were that short. We had so much we never even thought about it." That simple exchange captured the truth of December 1944. One side measured fuel by the gallon, the other by the millions. One fought desperately for each jerrycan, the other burned oceans without worry. The result was already decided before the battle began. German records prove it clearly. Army Group B's war diary for December 1944 read, "December 16th, offensive begins, fuel at 70% of minimum needs. December 17th, Peiper captures 50,000 gallons. December 18th, multiple depots destroyed, over 5 million gallons lost. December 19th, fuel critical, units stuck. December 24th, Peiper abandons vehicles, fuel completely gone. Meanwhile, the U.S. First Army records for those same days told a different story. December 16th, reserves at 3.7 million gallons. December 17th, 2.2 million gallons destroyed. December 18th, 1.8 million gallons received. December 24th, reserves 4.1 million. Americans treated millions like nothing, while Germans saved every single can. More than just how much they had, American fuel showed their better technology. Their refineries used special methods to make stronger gasoline faster than Germany's old process. American planes used 100-octane fuel that made them fly better than German planes, which ran on weaker 87-octane fuel. Americans also made special additives Germany couldn't copy. German engines built for low-quality fuel often broke down when using captured American gas. The fuel shortage affected every soldier. Corporal Hans Muller wrote on December 20th, "We marched 30 kilometers, no fuel for trucks. We passed empty American vehicles still running to keep warm. They left engines on. We walked through snow. Medical help was also failing. Ambulances couldn't move the wounded. Hospitals had no power. Many men died waiting for trucks that never came." Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting said, "We had good doctors and captured American supplies, but no fuel for ambulances. Men died who could have lived if we had fuel for just 10 kilometers." These truths broke German lies about weak Americans. Soldiers had been told Americans were soft, but then they saw they could destroy more than Germany ever owned. Goebbels wrote in his diary on December 28th, "Reports show big morale problems. Soldiers write about American strength, hurting our story, but those stories spread faster than censorship." The idea of German superiority died when they saw American logistics. The Ardennes failure left Germany with no choice but defense. General Jodl said at Nuremberg, "After the Ardennes, we knew it was over. We played our last card and found the enemy had all the aces." The Allies saw German weakness and started hitting fuel plants. By February 1945, German fuel was gone. The Luftwaffe couldn't fly, training stopped, and the Wehrmacht froze in place, destroyed piece by moving enemies. In spring 1945, strange scenes appeared. German units gave up not from fighting, but from standing still. Whole tank divisions sat helpless while Allies drove past. General Fritz Bolling said, "We had 42 tanks, good men and ammo, but only 300 liters of fuel, not enough for one town. We blew up our tanks and walked to surrender." Meanwhile, the American advance was held up only by traffic jams from having so many vehicles. The Third Army alone had 15,000 vehicles. Kampfgruppe Peiper's fuel crisis shows how industrial power decided World War II. When Peiper stood among the captured jerry cans that December morning, he saw the truth. They were fighting an enemy whose waste was bigger than their need. The numbers say it all. German offensive fuel allocation, 5 million gallons. Fuel destroyed by Americans, 8 million gallons. Daily American consumption, 7.5 million gallons. Peiper's capture at Honsfeld, 50,000 gallons. That was just 0.6% of American daily supply. The Battle of the Bulge killed 19,000 Americans, maybe 100,000 Germans, and destroyed Germany's last reserves. But its lasting effect was showing German soldiers the scale of American abundance. Peiper's discovery wasn't just about fuel, it was the nature of industrial warfare. Victory went to whoever produced the most petroleum, steel, and aluminum. Germany never had a real chance. The final irony, American forces cataloging abandoned German equipment at L'Église found 39 perfect tanks left behind only because they had no fuel. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report noted, "Fuel needed, 8,000 gallons. Classification, minimal. Source, local reserve. Time, 4 hours." What was impossible for Germans, 8,000 gallons to save their best tanks, was almost nothing to Americans. A small request using local reserves could save tanks beyond Kampfgruppe Peiper's peak strength. This was Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld. It wasn't just that America had more fuel, it was that American abundance worked on a scale that made German shortages meaningless. The war was over once American industry was fully mobilized. Honsfeld revealed what had been true since 1942. Germany fought the impossible, counting defeat in gallons, while America measured victory in oceans. The Tiger tank sits in L'Église Museum, fuel gauge empty, a monument to when tactical skill met logistical reality and lost. Visitors ask why such powerful tanks were abandoned. The answer, no fuel.